All right, everybody, come on in. It's Friday. It's a slightly delayed but worth it version of It's the Democracy Stupid. I'm joined today. I am very lucky to be joined today by Oona Hathaway, who is a Yale professor multiple times over, right? At the law school, in the Department of Political Science, at the School of Global Affairs. She directs again, got to get this right, the Yale Law School Center for Global Legal Challenges. And recently, she became the president of the American Society of International Law. And that is just the Cliff Notes version of her accomplishments. So, Oona, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
I have wanted to have this conversation for a while, but I'm not sure I'm going to like what I hear.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
I am in my late 60s. I've benefited my whole life from a global order whose roots really predate World War II, but whose institutions got built after that terrible, terrible disaster. And now I see that order and those institutions under attack here and elsewhere. And I'm not sure what replaces them. I don't think it's chaos. I think it's China, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But I'd like to spend our time together to understand what we had, what we might be losing, and what might come in its place.
Yeah, good. Those are great questions. So what we had, I think there's nothing like putting something at risk to understand what you had. So what we had was, in the post-war era, we put in place a remarkably effective system for keeping the peace. Not perfect by any means. We can point to all kinds of violations, but the data is very clear. The number of wars between major powers was basically zero. The conquest, which used to be very common among states, states taking land from one another, used to be very common, happened for hundreds of years, basically reduced to very rare. Does happen on occasion, but quite rare. Overall peace was much more widespread and a lot less war. And this was an intentional choice. This didn't just happen. It was because we had lived in a world for hundreds of years where states could resort to war whenever they liked. They were allowed to go to war for whatever reason they liked. In fact, it was the main way in which international law was enforced, was through war. And international law said you could use war to resolve your disputes. And so it was a decision. It was an intentional choice to reject that system. First in 1928, the Calabrian Pact, which obviously didn't work. And then in 1945, with the UN Charter, which reaffirmed that, created a whole institutional structure around it. So now all of that's at risk.
And we realize that's just
Yeah.
the peace side of international law. There's an enormous commercial side of international law that also grew up so that prosperity would grow alongside peace.
Yeah, and the two are intertwined, right? I mean, you're much freer to trade. You're much more willing to put valuable goods on a boat and ship it across the world if you believe that somebody's not just going to take it. You're much more willing to engage in trade relations with your neighbor or partner if you don't think that you're enriching somebody who's going to turn around and attack you. And so the two are very much intertwined.
Well, but let's talk about, people just don't know how pervasive this has been. People know about NATO, they misunderstand it. They know about trade, but not about WTO. They know about war crimes, but certainly not about treaties the U.S. never signed. I know no one thinks about international law when they get on an airplane in one country and land in another, but somehow that works just fine, right? How much does the system of international law and the institutions that make it possible impact our lives every day?
Yeah, I think you're getting at a kind of deep truth, which is that international law kind of sets the background features of our lives in ways that we just don't really understand. So the internet, is governed in part by the International Telecom Union. which is one of the oldest international organizations in existence. When you make a phone call or you use global communications networks, you're taking advantage of international law and the International Telecom Union. When you send, a letter from one country to another, and isn't it kind of amazing? You can buy a U.S. postage stamp, stick it on a letter, and your grandparent in another country can receive it. That is international law at work. When you're flying from one country to another, there's a whole web of international agreements that allow you to overfly those countries safely and securely without being threatened with being shot down. So it's a whole web of relationships that we don't really notice, except when they break down, right? We notice it when it starts to fail. We notice it when it's violated. But when it's working well, it's just kind of the background of our lives. But it's so much the background of our lives that we ought to, begin to understand how critically important this web of relationships really is to enabling modern life.
Yeah, when we think about it, as you began, as questions of war and peace, but it's really much more pervasive in our lives.
Yeah, it is. I mean, obviously, war and peace are critical because you only get the rest of those relationships working well if you kind of trust one another, right? If you're not sort of fearful of one another. But yes, I mean, international law, there's well more than 50,000 international treaties. They're on every you can possibly imagine. Yeah. I mean, on every topic you could possibly imagine. This is why teaching international law is sort of a crazy thing, because it's like teaching law. It's like everything.
Where are these treaties? I mean, here in the United States, we have a system of law. I'll talk about that in a second with you. But all those laws result, we can figure out what's current law because they get put in a code of federal regulations, a CFR, and you pretty much can tell what the body of law is in America that way. Is there anything like that with international law?
Yeah. So, I mean, the UN has a registry certainly for all multinational treaties that are UN treaties. It's not every single treaty, but a lot of the treaties are there. Yeah, some are secret. Absolutely. There are plenty of secret treaties. And then bilateral treaties are not necessarily all registered with the United Nations. So bilateral treaties being just, one country agrees with another. But a lot of them are registered with the United Nations. And now we have, of course, global systems for managing international agreements. And so a lot of these are registered and available. You can get them on Hein Online. I mean, there are ways in which you can get these registered international agreements, not every single one of them, but the vast majority. And in the United States, all international agreements have to be reported to Congress, and now Congress has to publish them under something called the CASE Act, Case-a-Blocky Act, that requires that these agreements be made public. But it's a whole separate story we could talk about. Not every single one is made public. I've actually written about the importance of greater transparency for international agreements and why those ought to all be published and made.
Oh boy, do I agree with you, and I'm going to talk about that too.
Yeah.
So we have international agreements, and then we built a whole. I can't even imagine how big this is or how many there are, but international institutions to enforce, adjudicate, and to, I guess, help make and keep those agreements.
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of managerial organizations, right? In many cases, it's not so much about enforcement, although they often entail some enforcement mechanisms, but often it's just about, look, states are creating these agreements because they have a benefit from creating these agreements, right? States are joining into these agreements because they think, hey, this is in my mutual interest. And then they create these organizations to help, sometimes to resolve disputes, to manage it, to update it. There's something like the International Coffee Organization, so coffee growing nations create their international organization. They have a treaty that they agree to, and then they have a council that meets on a regular basis to oversee the agreement and make sure that it's updated and that it's managed. So there are thousands of international organizations on, obviously the United Nations, but then, all the way down to much smaller organizations.
Well, the one you named that manages the internet, or the one that makes sure that postal system works globally.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I have two sort of threshold questions, maybe more, about whether it's sustainable. One is, I'm going to say my opinion here, and you do not have to agree with it. You can consider it hypothetical for this question. But we have the most corrupt government we've ever had. We have a weaponized Justice Department. Congress has ceded to the executive branch the powers of the purse and the power to wage war. Today, for God's sake, is the threshold day for the War Powers Act. I know you wrote about that this morning. That says that war has to cease unless Congress acts. Congress won't act, and that war won't cease. So it's, whether you agree with that or not, the rule of law, in my view, and at least for this hypothetical, is in danger in the United States.
Yeah.
Can an international law system exist when a nation as large and powerful as ours decides that the rule of law doesn't matter?
Yeah, it makes it much harder, right? I mean, look, we've just talked about how complex and multidimensional the international legal order is. And even as the president is sort of putting under threat the UN Charter, ignoring the UN Charter, waging a war that seems to be in tension, at least, with our obligations under the Geneva Conventions, and violating rules relating to the law of the sea and putting in place the blockades. Like, there's lots of ways in which he's violating the law. Even so, lots of other stuff is still happening, just as it always has, right? We're still sending our letters. We're still, doing overflight. We're still, goods and services are traversing international boundaries. A lot of the stuff is still happening. I just was at the American Society of International Law's annual meeting, over 1,000 international lawyers in one place, half of them practitioners. They have very robust day jobs. They're working hard. There's a lot to be done, right? So international business transactions, all these things, this is all happening still. And nothing the president's doing is going to stop that. But over time, the erosion of trust, the erosion of security, the erosion of safety, the erosion of trust in international law, and the erosion of trust in the United States as a good player, as a state that can be trusted, as a state that is going to play by the rules, as a state that's going to be stable, that a state that will do what it says it's going to do, that is going to significantly undermine the system as a whole. And that could put the rest of it at risk. I think it's, at the moment, things are still moving along, and those things will continue to exist regardless. Having a state like the United States prepared to sort of chuck international law out the window is not good for the international system, no doubt about it. It doesn't mean the whole thing grounds to a halt. Things are keeping on, but it does put the whole thing at risk. Yeah, I mean, and lots of things that, every ordinary person is going to care about.
Yep. Well, that's, so our behavior impacts it that way. On one other way, when this system was put in place post World War II, it was the partnership between America and Europe that largely did it and largely made it successful and legitimized it. That partnership is also in jeopardy at the moment by this administration. I mean, after all, if Russia's attacking from one side, we should say we'll take Greenland on the other. That's not a friendly act, right? So the legitimacy of the system has to. Let me say it differently. As you pointed out, the need persists. People that want to do international work, they want to do international travel, they want to do international communications, all of which requires some. I mean, you can't just walk around the world anymore. There are borders, there are all kinds of things. There have to be rules.
Yeah.
If we make them illegitimate, if the powers that made them legitimate and gave them their legitimacy don't no longer agree, the question is, does it disappear, or does someone else step in and give it legitimacy? And here I'm thinking China, because that sure sounds like what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think that, the United States is going to withdraw, has already been withdrawing from the international system in the ways that we've talked about, also literally withdrawing from international agreements, in ways that just make zero sense, like pulling out of the International Law Commission. That's where you make international law. You influence the creation of international law. Like, pulling out of that is just really hard to imagine what the logic is there. Whether you believe in international law or not, like, You want a seat at the table. So, and who's stepping into those seats? Who's stepping into the places where we're withdrawing? Yeah, definitely. China is playing a significant role. This is a great opportunity for China to take a leadership role in the world. That happened with World Health Organization. We pulled out of it. China stepped right in. And to some degree, it's to their credit, right? Like, I mean, they're helping to keep some of these organizations go, but
and to their benefit.
It's absolutely to their benefit. And the thing is, they understand how much power and authority and legitimacy you get from being a leader in these international organizations, and how much you can accomplish through being a part of these international organizations that you could never accomplish on your own. And they have been wanting to have this opportunity for a long time, and it's just being delivered up to them on a silver platter, right? I mean, it is really extraordinary.
We're throwing it away.
We are completely throwing it away. We're completely throwing it away. Yeah, and it's what's so maddening about it is that the justification is strengthening the United States, but it's doing the exact opposite. I mean, it is so weakening the United States to just give up this authority and power that we have worked hard to create over the course of really since World War I. We have been the leaders in the international system. We have been shaping this international system. We literally wrote the UN Charter. It was a small working group within the U.S. State Department that wrote the first draft of the UN Charter. We championed it. It reflects our values and our interests, and we're just chucking that out the window. And it's just it's unfathomable because it's so frustrating as an international layer. Like, of course, I care about international law, but I'm an American too, and I care deeply about America, and I care about us doing what makes sense for the United States and its standing in the world, and its ability to reflect and pursue its values. And we're just giving that up. We're just giving that up, and it's just impossible to square with what they say they're doing and what they're actually accomplishing.
And this also extends to the global financial system, which has been enormously beneficial to the United States. And I know China's wanted to replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. They don't have to succeed in doing it to undermine the system that we put in place.
Yeah, well, and we are really shooting ourselves in the feet there too, right? So all these sanctions that we're putting in place, all the tariffs that we're slapping on countries with the kind of willy-nilly use of sanctions against judges and lawyers at the International Criminal Court, all these things that we're doing is encouraging de-dollarization. And there's a tipping point. We don't know exactly when that tipping point is going to arrive. Like the dollar has been the reserve currency of choice for a really long time. It hasn't really had a serious competitor, and we've been able to, that has given us extraordinary authority and power, because basically all major financial transactions have to be done in the dollar.
Yep.
And that means the United States just has so much ability to leverage its financial position with the rest of the world. And that's what brought Iran, frankly, to the negotiating table the first time with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Was we basically put in place what's called secondary sanctions,
right,
which is powerful because what they say is like, you have to choose. You do business with Iranian banks, or you do business with American banks. And everybody's like, we're doing business with American banks. Like, that's not the choice,
even question,
right? Not even close. And so like Iran's like, we have no choice. We're being strangled. Like, we have to show up at the negotiating table. Well, we're now encouraging states to look elsewhere. We're encouraging states to start doing their deals in, other currencies. And it hasn't broken yet, but it will. If we keep this up, it will. And then we're going to understand how much authority and power we had that we just gave away, that we just destroyed. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a much less a reported aspect of this that people are not really paying attention to, is the fact that, like, we take for granted that all business is going to be done in the US dollar, but that is a result of like good, careful management of our currency. I mean, our debt just reached 100% of our GDP, like extraordinary. And the instability that comes from that is significant. So it's been decades of like careful management of the dollar, of being reliable, of using sanctions only in cases that were sort of justifiable and, consistent with international legal commitments. And we're just throwing that
Same
all
with
out the window.
tariffs. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. All right. Well, so we're throwing this away, much to our peril. And now, so let's talk about why we're doing this. I was working in the UK a lot during the Brexit debate. And I saw how vulnerable international institutions are to claims that they cost individuals their sovereignty. Oh,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I heard, oh, those faceless bureaucrats in Brussels,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
don't control our own borders.
Yeah.
Heard that here after that. I mean,
Yeah.
the same language that works in one place works in another to convince people that international law is just bad for us. It just
Yeah.
means that we have no say, that somebody over there, and it is tied to an ancient, there's a secret international order, usually means Jews, that really are controlling everything, and we don't have any control, and it's time.
Yeah. Yeah. This idea of sovereignty is a really interesting one, right? People often talk about it and they don't really know what they mean when they use that word, but it's like something kind of like, we care about American sovereignty or we care about British sovereignty. And I think what they're trying to reflect is this idea of control or, control over their own lives, control over the world, what exactly, but I think it's control over their territory, over their own policies, over their own, over their own government. And I think, I've spent a lot of my career sort of puzzling over that because it's not a new critique of international law. The international law somehow undermines sovereignty, right? This has been a longstanding critique of international law. You're giving away your sovereignty when you're agreeing to this agreement. I think what people don't understand when they make that critique is that, we live in a globalized world. No state can exist on its own. No state can exist without interaction with other states. I mean, they could perhaps in theory do that, but they would be much poorer for it. North Korea is a good example of a state that sort of kind of tried to do it on its own, and its people are starving.
Yeah, Albania for a long time.
Right.
But not
Yeah.
anymore.
Right.
Much better
I mean,
since
these
they
are,
stopped.
yeah, right. Like, that's what you get when you close yourself off from everybody else. You get lots of sovereignty, but you get like, inability to feed your own people, like, inability to really have any influence outside your own borders. And most of international law, again, it's international law grounded in state consent. A treaty does not exist, does not bind a state unless the state has agreed to the treaty. And why do states agree to treaties? Because the people who are making the decisions, which are the representatives in the United States, representatives of the American people, think that it's in the American best interest. Why do they think that? Well, because it usually is. They're generally right.
How do you deal with this
yeah.
case? Let's say we enter into a treaty. It is in the best interest of the American people, and we feel that way. Times change, and we think maybe it's not in our best interest anymore. But the pace of changing these international agreements is a lot slower than the pace of calling your local city council person to say, I need a stop sign at the end of my block, and dealing with it. And you feel like it's not responsive anymore, and that you're somehow trapped in a system that is no longer as flexible as we need to be for the lives we live.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, there are situations where withdrawal from a treaty is appropriate, right? So let's say you join a treaty and that over time it no longer serves the state's best interests. The vast majority of treaties have explicit withdrawal provisions that say, here's how you get out, and you can make the decision to get out, and that's lawful. In other cases, there are treaties that, when you first joined, you thought you were getting one thing, maybe you end up getting another thing, or, in this particular instance, it's not exactly serving your interests, but over the long haul, it does, and so I think the question is, in some instances with those treaties, you're agreeing to do some things in the short term that you might maybe not prefer to do, but it gives you the authority to get other states to also do what they would not necessarily choose to do. So like take the World Trade Organization, it has limitations on the kinds of trade restrictions you can put in place on the import of goods from other countries. And there are instances where states are like, I would really like to put really high tariffs on steel. I would really like to put really high tariffs on agricultural goods because, my domestic industry is hurting. And the international organization, the GATT, the International Organization, the Government Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, basically put limits on what you can do. There are constraints on how often you can do that, when you can do it, and how you can do it. And you might violate the rules to do that. But so in that instance, you have a choice. Do you stay in it? Do you break it? Or do you comply with it? And those are all available options, so you could withdraw altogether, but then you lose access to the lower trade barriers from every other country that's a party to the World Trade Organization, which are huge benefits that you're getting because everybody else has to do the exact same thing, right? They all also have to let American goods in that they might prefer to put limitations on, but they can't because they're legally prohibited from doing it. So I think you have to decide, yes, okay, in this instance, maybe there's some things I would rather do if I had my druthers, but the constraints on my action now means that I get access to a lot of things that are really important to me, like lower access to send my exports abroad without them being taxed by these other countries, and that in the end is best for the American economy, even though in the short term, in this particular way, I don't really love what it's doing. And that's the kind of choices you have to make with international law. Sometimes you decide the trade-offs aren't worth it and you pull out altogether, but you don't want to just look at the short-term cost and say, okay, in this one instance, it's causing me to do something I'd rather not do, without taking account of the fact that there's all these benefits that you're getting from being a part of this international agreement.
So the you in that description that you just gave, you have these things to consider. You decide whether you want to stay or go. You decide whether you want to just violate it and get called on it later, but keep the whole thing in place. The question of who is you is a problem for voters everywhere, right? Yeah. Because it feels like you have to be a Yale brilliant scholar, part of that you, and that the average voter is like, who's you? This I don't know who these organizations are. I don't know who's in them. It doesn't occur to them that and I'm even sure the members of Congress know who's in them. So how do we make this something that people can not only can benefit from but can trust?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's something I struggle with, and I'm trying to figure out the answer to that question.
Well, you teach it. Part of it is to teach.
I do teach it. Yeah, I teach it. And, and I'm taking on the presidency of the American Society of International Law. And one of the things I'm trying to think about is how do we do a better job explaining this to the general public? I think one of the challenges is that it can get very technical very fast. But there are ways of explaining these things in fairly simple terms as well, right? The idea that, when you make a deal with another country, they're going to let your goods in without putting, slapping tariffs on them. And you're going to let their goods in without slapping tariffs on them. And it's in everybody's best interest to basically bind themselves to agree to that. I think that's fairly straightforward. I think that people can understand the basics of it, right?
I understand that, but we have, I think, just over 1 million elected offices in the United States. We're used to knowing who's the one who's making the decision, right? And that goes from school board to, in Chicago, like mosquito abatement district, right? We elect people to all kinds of things. So we know who they are. And if we don't like it, we can go call on them. But all of these international organizations, that's not how it works. And we have no idea who are these people making these decisions and who are they accountable to is a very opaque world. And it asks a lot of citizens. When I was in London, you kind of knew who you sent to Brussels, and still it was opaque.
Yeah, I think that's a fair critique, and I think it's one of the reasons that people feel a kind of sense of disconnection or lack of understanding of these international organizations, and sort of maybe a kind of reflexive skepticism of them because they feel so far away, they feel so technical, they feel foreign, literally.
We don't know who's on them. We don't know
who's on them. I think the thing to remember, though, is that those organizations can only do what we've agreed to, right? So we've entered into a treaty that creates a set of rules. And those international organizations really are about enforcing the rules that we've written and that we've agreed to. And that these international organizations have extremely constrained power to act on their own. You know, very few of them can sort of like just say, okay, we're going to change this or that. The reason that you have to have these international organizations with an assembly of state parties, which is usually these international organizations have the state parties, you know, have a regular conference, is if you're going to change anything, you got to go back to the states that made the international organization and say, hey, here's what we want to do. And we want to change this thing. And here's how we want to change it. So it's really the U.S. State Department, you know, in most cases, and the Secretary of Defense, and then the people within the State Department that are under the Secretary of Defense, they're making these decisions for the American people. And then in Congress, it's the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that approves international agreements. You know, so it is our members in the end that are, it's our representatives in the end that are making these decisions. So I think people shouldn't feel too much like, oh, we're giving away this power to these international kind of overlords, you know, who are running the show. That authority is extremely constrained. Like,
and we send representatives to sit on these different bodies.
Absolutely. You know, yes,
who makes the decision of who sends them? Is that an administrative decision?
It's in the most case, in the most cases, the executive branch. I mean, it's the executive branch, but it varies across the different organizations. It's often the State Department, though, that is making those decisions. Of course, we have ambassadors all around the world who are also representing us in discussions. But yeah, we usually have someone who's authorized to speak on behalf of the United States through the State Department, who's representing us in our interests, and they're ultimately answerable to us. You know, they're answerable to us because they're answerable. They, you know, they only have the authority that they're given by the Secretary of State, and then the Secretary of State is supposed to be accountable to all of us. That accountability hasn't been working very well lately.
That's a different topic for sure. An important one. But like every organization, even domestically, I mean, I was a long time ago as a young man was on the Chicago City Council, and, you know, piles of my colleagues went to jail. So even institutions where you know everybody, they can become corrupt. Yeah. And there's always a claim, there's been the claim about the UN for a long time in America, that it's corrupt, that it's just doesn't do its job. It's wasting piles of money, lining people's pockets, whatever. How do we I mean, again, it requires a lot of transparency to evaluate that challenge, that charge. How do we know? How do we assure Americans that these institutions either aren't corrupt or there's a mechanism in place, as there is here in Chicago for the culling of crooked aldermen, that will make sure that, you know, it heads in the direction that we want it to head in.
Yeah, I mean, look, these are legitimate concerns always with government, any kind of government, whether it's domestic, whether it's local, whether it's international, you know, to ensure that the money's being spent wisely and that there are the necessary controls in place to ensure that the money is being used for the purposes that it has been devoted. And there are internal controls within the UN for exactly that, and also transparency mechanisms to ensure that money's been wisely spent. It's a lot smaller budget than you might imagine for the amount of things that it does. Is there bloat? Yes, there certainly is. I mean, part of the reason for that is that, you know, you've got an organization with 193 states that are party to it, and lots of states want to have their say, you know, and they want to have seats at the table, and so, you know, there's a lot of efforts to kind of accommodate that, right?
It will never be it will never be an organization designed to be efficient. That's not what it's for. It's designed for different purposes.
Right. It's designed for collaboration and cooperation, you know, and it does that really well. I mean, are there ways in which elements of it could be made more efficient? Sure, absolutely. And I think that there's efforts to try and look for that. And I think it's an appropriate thing to ask. There's going to be a new Secretary General coming in. That should be one of the things that, you know, the U.S. in interviewing Secretary General candidates should be asking, you know, how are you going to ensure that the money is spent for the purposes that it's intended? And how do you make sure that proper financial controls are going to be in place? But look, it does in a remarkable amount that saves us a lot of money, I will say. You know, so just take UN peacekeeping missions. UN
Mhm.
peacekeeping missions have been remarkably successful. The independent scholarly work on the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping missions in places of conflict suggests that they reduce the amount of ongoing conflict. They save people's lives. They prevent the harm, and they prevent U.S. soldiers from having to come and solve problems down the road. Saves us a lot of money, So I think we don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish. There's a lot of ways in which UNESCO does important things for saving children's lives, providing basic food and support, medical support and the rest for children that allows them to grow up healthy and strong and, lead productive lives that contribute to the global economy. So there are a lot of things that the UN does that are, pay dividends many times over.
I'm a fan.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be asking a question that challenges its mission or even its value, but in order to protect that, look again, to go back to my city council example.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. I think it's good that we have one, right? But when people get corrupt, they get indicted and convicted and taken away, and we go have another election. Are there examples where people in the UN have been indicted, convicted, taken away, like any other, like the United States Senate, like any body of government that we have? It encourages humans to sometimes do some things they shouldn't do.
It's a good question, and
we hold them accountable.
Yeah, it's a fair question. Look, I think there are a lot of eyes looking on everything that's happening at the UN, and I think it's not so easy to get away with something like that. Because there's so many interested parties who are involved who are keeping an eye on things. But yeah, look, I'm not aware of any allegations of corruption that haven't been investigated and prosecuted. And I think I know that there's plenty of allegations running around there, but I don't think that any of them have been backed up with facts. People just look at the fact that this is a big organization and they figure, there must be some corruption going on there. I don't know that I have seen any claims.
It's interesting that there isn't a policing mechanism as there is in American government, right?
I think that there is. I don't pretend to be an expert on the sort of bureaucratic inner workings of the United Nations, but I do know that they're very sensitive to these kinds of critiques, and they understand states are not going to give their contributions that they're required to give if they don't believe that money's being spent for the purposes it's supposed to be spent for. And there are, ordinary public accounting and oversight tools and mechanisms in the UN, just as there are in any significant international organization.
That's good.
And from what I understand, those have been very effective. And I haven't seen any credible claims that there's been a significant breakdown that leads us to think that there's a real problem here.
The one that's been I'm sorry to do this. The one that's been in the news most is whether the High Commission on Refugees somehow was complicit in the Hamas attack, right? And that kind of talk sounds more political than real to me, but it certainly has an impact on how people feel about the organization and how does it defend itself in real time.
Yeah. So there's two different questions there, right? There's the question of is there corruption, i.e. private stealing? And then there's the question of is the money going to fund organizations right. And this came up with UNRWA and its connections and work in Gaza. And frankly, there are a lot of places like Gaza, like Yemen, where there are conflict situations where the governing entities on the ground are entities that we would regard as terrorist organizations, right? So same problem in Yemen, same problem in another number of conflict areas where you have a non-state actor group that controls an area, that effectively governs an area. And Hamas has been governing Gaza for quite some time. They have the police. They are the government they do all the governmental services. They run the schools, they run the, fire department, they do all these things. Right. And so if you're going to be doing humanitarian work, you have to work with the folks who actually are governing the place where you're doing that humanitarian work. And there is a choice. Like, do you say, well, as long as this terrorist organization, is running the show, we're going to have nothing to do with it, and we're not going to provide any money to like allow children to be able to eat, to allow there to be clean water, to allow, hospitals to function. Or, and this is a choice that the Obama administration was facing in Yemen, was, this is a similar problem. Do we keep a terrorist designation in place that means that NGOs can't provide basic humanitarian support to people who are dying of cholera, like worst cholera epidemic in modern history took place in Yemen? Do we just basically say like, not our problem, like people are dying, massive, like horrific things happening on the ground. Children are, not getting enough food to eat. Like but terrorists are the ones who are running the show. So we can't do anything. Not only can we not do anything, we can't let anybody else do anything either, because if there's a terrorist designation,
right, that's what that
NGOs
does.
Can't operate without being at risk of criminal prosecution. And, so these are the hard choices that humanitarians have to make all the time. Like, do you say that, we're not going to provide this basic humanitarian aid in places where the governing organization is one that is engaging in terrorist activities? Or do we say, look, we're not going to support anything that they're doing. Like, obviously, we're not going to support the terrorist activities that they're undertaking, but we're going to do the best we can to allow people to have the minimum that they need to be able to survive.
Right. We make these choices all the time, and we don't always make them well. I think of Cuba, which is very near here, and the suffering that's going on there. And but the Castro family regime, 60 years ago, decided to point some nuclear weapons our way, and that's not something you forgive easily, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very tough questions. Very
tough, right? And I think, and I mean, I have to, putting my own cards on the table. Like, I think in the end, like, saving children from starvation is
something you do.
A higher value, right?
Like that, yes,
something you do, right? And does that mean that sometimes you have to work with people that you think are abhorrent, and that, you think, should not be in charge, and that you would do everything you could to prevent them from carrying out their aims? But sometimes you nonetheless have to be able to do business with them on this very basic level. I think that that's the choice that the UN is sometimes faced with, because it is in the worst conflict situations in the world, and the worst conflict situations in the world don't have functioning governments. That's the reality of it. So
they don't have the very thing that we've been talking about, which is international law. They don't have these rules that we don't see, that have protected us in so many ways. So if we decide, if a wand gets waved and either the current administration has a change of heart about their view of the world, or they disappear and a different takes place, and we decide to re-engage in the world, re-engage, what are the things that we need to do to undo the damage that's been done? And what are the things that we could do differently than we did in the past?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question to ask. So first of all, I think that our trust is at a new low. I lived in Germany in the fall, and talked to lots of Europeans, and I spend time at the UN and talked to lots of representatives at the UN, and traditional allies, people who believe in America, who believed in the message of who we are and what we stood for, and who have seen America as a bright and shining light, that sets an example for the world, are kind of paralyzed by the disconnect between that image of who we are and what we are doing in the world right now. And the things we're saying and the things that we're doing are just so much at odds with that long held view about who America is. That is, it's really extraordinary to talk to people who just can't quite compute, what they're seeing, the America that they thought they knew doing in the world, which is so at odds with this history. And I think it's shaken our longstanding allies. It's shaken them. It's shaken their trust. And I don't think that just sort of voting somebody into office, whether Republican or Democratic, who is like going to talk about much better game about the international order and sort of want to make nice, is going to be enough. Because we did that. We voted Biden into office. And he sort of made nice with everybody, and then we voted Trump in office, and he came in, much worse than he was the first time around. And everybody kind of knew what he was going to do, and the American people voted for it. So, I think there's a lot of lack of trust. I think we've probably done generational harm to our standing in the world. I think it's going to take a generation to really build that trust. But I think the first step is going to have to be what Biden didn't do, which is real accountability. Real accountability for the where law has been broken. We need to call that out. I really think we need to put in place democratic reforms, like structural democratic reforms, real war powers reform, reforming emergency powers, strengthening Congress's ability to push back. Congress should have its own Office of Legal Counsel. It should have, structural mechanisms in place to be able to push back much more effectively. And probably we're going to have to do some jurisdiction stripping with the Supreme Court. I just think the Supreme Court has been really undermining the ability of Congress to put any kind of real constraints on the executive branch. But like a whole host of democratic structural reforms to basically ensure that if we have out of control executive branch again, that they're not going to be able to do so much damage so fast.
This is fascinating.
That's essential.
Because as I hear you, I just want to repeat it to make sure I understand it. The best thing that we can do to restore, to build a better future in international law is to fix the rule of law in America. And
I think so.
That's fascinating.
So.
That's really fascinating.
I think so, because people see the lawlessness, and they see that that President Trump is so unconstrained that it's just his whims that are running the world. He decides on his own morality that he's going to launch a war, and the rest of the world pays the price. And that's a failure of our right. It's a failure of our Constitution. It's a failure of the War Powers Resolution. It's a failure of internal constraints to be effective. And that then leads to
international law. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
So when I asked this theoretical question earlier and said you don't have to agree, but it's a theoretical question, I now know that you do, and I appreciate that. Listen, I love what you do. I am a believer in this question of sovereignty. Look, people get married. When they get married, they're not alone in the world anymore. It turns out that it's a good idea. So this question of sovereignty seems silly in some ways, but I think what you do is helping to make this complicated world more transparent, its value more better understood, all of which will help it avoid the kinds of attacks it's been under. So thank you so much for your leadership in that world.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak about these issues and for casting a light on the importance of international rule of law as well as domestic rule of law. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.